What if I told you that Miami was once a silent world of mangroves and moonlit water, long before the skyline ever existed? Welcome to Richard's History. I'm Richard, and today we journey back to Miami in the 1600s. If you enjoy thoughtful historical storytelling, please consider subscribing for future episodes. Some visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. Now, let's step back in time. I hope this story brings you reflection and calm. When we picture Miami today, it is almost impossible not to think of glass towers, glowing skylines, and crowded boulevards stretching along the Atlantic coast. But if we step back into the 1600s, all of that disappears. There were no skyscrapers rising into the humid sky, no electric lights shimmering across the water at night, no streets, no hotels, no city in any recognizable sense. What existed here was something entirely different. In the 17th century, the place we now call Miami was a remote and largely isolated region on the edge of the Atlantic world. European maps were expanding during this period, yet the southeastern tip of Florida remained sparsely documented and lightly touched by permanent colonial settlement. There was no urban center here, no planned grid, no harbor filled with merchant ships. Instead, this coastline was defined by tidal rhythms, shifting shorelines, and dense coastal vegetation. Time in this landscape was not measured by church bells or mechanical clocks. It was marked by the steady rise and fall of the tides in Biscayne Bay, by the seasonal movement of fish, and by the slow growth of mangrove forests, whose tangled roots gripped the shallow waters. The Everglades stretched inland as a vast mosaic of sawgrass marshes, freshwater sloughs, and hardwood hammocks. Together, Biscayne Bay and the Everglades formed a complex and highly productive ecosystem that shaped every aspect of human life in the region. For those who lived here, the land was not empty, and it was not waiting to become a city. It was already a complete world. The coastline was lined with thick mangrove stands that created natural barriers, making access difficult for outsiders. Shallow reefs and shifting sandbars added another layer of protection. From a European perspective, this was a challenging and marginal environment. From an ecological perspective, it was extraordinarily rich. If we pause and imagine standing along the shore around 1650, we would not see a skyline. We would see open water, low horizons, and an uninterrupted sweep of green. The air would carry the scent of salt and wet earth. The only lights at night would come from the stars and perhaps small fires along the shore. This was Miami in the 1600s, not a city in its early stage, but a sacred and untamed wilderness shaped by water, stone, and time. When we picture Miami today, it is almost impossible not to think of glass towers, glowing skylines, and crowded boulevards stretching along the Atlantic coast. But if we step back into the 1600s, all of that disappears. There were no skyscrapers rising into the humid sky, no electric lights shimmering across the water at night, no streets, no hotels, no city in any recognizable sense. What existed here was something entirely different. In the 17th century, the place we now call Miami was a remote and largely isolated region on the edge of the Atlantic world. European maps were expanding during this period, yet the southeastern tip of Florida remained sparsely documented and lightly touched by permanent colonial settlement. There was no urban center here, no planned grid, no harbor filled with merchant ships. Instead, this coastline was defined by tidal rhythms, shifting shorelines, and dense coastal vegetation. Time in this landscape was not measured by church bells or mechanical clocks. It was marked by the steady rise and fall of the tides in Biscayne Bay, by the seasonal movement of fish, and by the slow growth of mangrove forests, whose tangled roots gripped the shallow waters. The Everglades stretched inland as a vast mosaic of sawgrass marshes, freshwater sloughs, and hardwood hammocks. Together, Biscayne Bay and the Everglades formed a complex and highly productive ecosystem that shaped every aspect of human life in the region. For those who lived here, the land was not empty, and it was not waiting to become a city. It was already a complete world. The coastline was lined with thick mangrove stands that created natural barriers, making access difficult for outsiders. Shallow reefs and shifting sandbars added another layer of protection. From a European perspective, this was a challenging and marginal environment. From an ecological perspective, it was extraordinarily rich. If we pause and imagine standing along the shore around 1650, we would not see a skyline. We would see open water, low horizons, and an uninterrupted sweep of green. The air would carry the scent of salt and wet earth. The only lights at night would come from the stars and perhaps small fires along the shore. This was Miami in the 1600s. Not a city in its early stage, but a sacred and untamed wilderness shaped by water, stone, and time. To understand Miami in the 1600s, we have to slow down and truly look at the landscape itself. This was not simply open coastline waiting to be settled. It was a layered and powerful ecosystem that shaped every human decision made within it. Nature here was not a backdrop. It was the defining force. Along the coast, dense mangrove forests formed a living barrier between land and sea. Their roots twisted and knotted together in shallow saltwater, creating thick walls that were extremely difficult to cross without local knowledge. For outsiders arriving by ship, these mangroves were not inviting. They concealed the shoreline, limited landing points, and made large-scale access complicated. For the people who understood them, however, these forests were protective and full of life. Inland, the Everglades stretched across southern Florida as a vast and slow-moving river of grass. This was not a single swamp, but a complex mosaic of sawgrass marshes, tree islands, freshwater channels, and seasonal wetlands. Travel through this terrain required skill and experience. Even today, parts of the Everglades remain challenging to navigate. In the 17th century, without modern tools or mapped routes, it was even more formidable. Between these two worlds lay Biscayne Bay, a shallow subtropical lagoon rich in marine life. Its waters supported fish, shellfish, and other coastal resources that sustained indigenous communities for generations. The bay connected freshwater and saltwater systems, creating a dynamic and productive environment. It was both a source of food and a transportation network. During much of the 1600s, there were no permanent European towns established in this immediate region. While Spanish ships sailed along the Florida coast and occasional expeditions passed through, sustained colonial settlement did not take root here in the way it did in other parts of the Americas. As a result, European footprints in this specific area remained limited. Nature, in this context, functioned as both fortress and provider. The mangroves and wetlands discouraged large-scale intrusion, while the bay and surrounding waters offered abundance. For those who lived here, survival did not come from conquering the land, but from understanding it. When we look at the daily life of the Tequesta in the 1600s, what stands out most clearly is their deep reliance on the sea. Unlike many other societies of the early modern world, they did not build their economy around large-scale agriculture. There is no strong evidence that they developed extensive farming systems comparable to those seen in parts of North America or Europe. Instead, their primary source of sustenance came from the waters of Biscayne Bay and the surrounding coastal environment. Archaeological findings, including shell middens and fishing remains, show that marine resources formed the backbone of their diet. Fish, shellfish, and other coastal species were central to survival. To harvest these resources effectively required skill, timing, and intimate environmental knowledge. The Tequesta understood tidal cycles, seasonal changes, and the behavior of marine life. This was not accidental knowledge. It was accumulated through generations of observation and practice. Central to this way of life was the canoe. Dugout canoes, carved from large tree trunks, allowed the Tequesta to move efficiently through shallow bays, tidal creeks, and narrow mangrove channels. If you imagine the landscape we discussed earlier, dense with roots and wetlands, it becomes clear that walking alone would not have been enough. The canoe transformed water into a transportation network. What might appear to an outsider as impassable swamp became, for them, a connected and navigable world. These waterways linked fishing grounds, settlement areas, and ceremonial sites. Canoes made it possible to travel across saltwater and brackish water with confidence. In this sense, the Tequesta did not simply survive in a difficult environment, they mastered it. their society was largely self-sufficient. With rich marine resources and access to varied ecosystems, they did not depend heavily on distant trade networks for basic survival. While contact with Europeans would occur at times during the colonial period, their daily life in the 17th century remained rooted in local systems of food gathering and community organization. When we reflect on this, it challenges modern assumptions about progress and development. The Tequesta built no stone ports or visible monuments along the coast, yet they sustained a functioning society in one of the most complex ecosystems in North America. Their independence was not isolation in a negative sense. It was a deliberate and effective adaptation to place. In the heart of modern downtown Miami, archaeologists uncovered something that forces us to rethink the deep history of this place. Known today as the Miami Circle, this site consists of a series of carved holes and basins cut directly into the limestone bedrock. It is widely associated with the Tequesta and is dated to many centuries before modern development. For anyone standing there now, surrounded by high-rise buildings, it can be difficult to imagine what this ground once represented. The structure was not built from stacked stone blocks or monumental walls. Instead, it was carefully shaped into the natural limestone itself. This detail matters. Carving into bedrock required planning, labor, and intention. It suggests that the people who created it were organizing communal effort around something meaningful. Archaeologists generally interpret the Miami Circle as the foundation of a structure, likely connected to ceremonial or elite activity. There is no evidence that this site functioned as a commercial marketplace in the European sense. It was not a port facility or a trading warehouse. The layout and associated artifacts indicate ritual and social importance rather than economic exchange. This distinction is important for us as modern viewers. We often measure historical significance by commerce or urban scale, but for the Tequesta, spiritual and communal life formed the core of society. The presence of such a site reveals a structured community with shared beliefs and coordinated construction efforts. It points to leadership, social organization, and a developed spiritual worldview. The Miami Circle stands as material evidence that this was not a scattered or loosely connected population. It was a society with depth and continuity. When I think about the Miami Circle today, I cannot help but see it as a sacred heart beneath the modern city. Beneath the pavement and traffic lies a reminder that Miami's earliest identity was not commercial or urban. It was spiritual, communal, and deeply rooted in the land itself. If there is one place that anchors the ancient history of Miami in physical reality, it is the Miami Circle. Discovered in 1998 during construction in downtown Miami, this archaeological site revealed a pattern of circular holes and basins carved directly into the limestone bedrock. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials indicates that the site dates back many centuries, long before European arrival, and it is widely connected to the Tequesta people who inhabited this region. What makes the Miami Circle remarkable is not monumental size, but intention. The carvings were cut into solid limestone, forming a nearly perfect circle about 38 feet in diameter. This was not random erosion or natural formation. It required planning, organized labor, and a shared purpose. For a community without metal tools in the early periods of its construction, shaping bedrock would have demanded time and collective effort. Archaeologists generally interpret the site as the foundation of a structure, possibly used for ceremonial gatherings, or as the residence of a leader with spiritual authority. Artifacts found at the site, including tools and remains of daily activity, suggest that it was part of a larger settlement complex. Still, the circular design and its careful placement indicate symbolic meaning beyond simple shelter. It is important to understand what the Miami Circle was not. There is no evidence that it functioned as a marketplace or commercial hub in the European sense. It was not designed around trade stalls or storage facilities. Instead, the archaeological consensus points toward ritual and communal significance. This tells us something powerful about Tequesta society. Their center was not defined by commerce, but by shared belief and social cohesion. For us today, standing in a city defined by finance, tourism, and global trade, the Miami Circle offers a different starting point. It reminds us that the earliest known structured space in this area was spiritual at its core. It reflects a society with leadership, ceremonial life, and organized construction. In that sense, the Miami Circle can be understood as the sacred heart of ancient Miami, quietly enduring beneath the modern skyline. When we speak about Miami in the 1600s, it is important to be precise. There were no lasting European settlements established in the immediate Biscayne Bay region during most of the 17th century. Spanish colonial power was firmly present in Florida, especially in places like St. Augustine, but the southeastern tip of the peninsula remained lightly settled and geographically distant from the main colonial centers. That does not mean the region was isolated from global events. Spanish ships regularly sailed through the Florida Straits, carrying silver, goods, and people between the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe. These waters were part of a major maritime corridor of the Spanish Empire. The coastline, near present-day Miami, lay along this route, and the surrounding reefs were dangerous. Coral formations and shifting shoals caused numerous shipwrecks over the centuries. Historical records and archaeological evidence indicate that indigenous groups in southern Florida, including the Tequesta, encountered the material remains of these wrecks. Goods from damaged vessels, sometimes washed ashore, or were recovered from shallow waters. In certain cases, there were exchanges between Spanish crews and local indigenous communities. In other instances, tensions or conflict occurred, particularly when control over valuable cargo was at stake. It is important not to exaggerate these interactions. The documentary record is limited, and much of what we understand comes from fragmented Spanish accounts and later archaeological interpretation. We do not have detailed narratives from the Tequesta perspective. As a result, many aspects of this contact remain uncertain. What we can say with confidence is that the Tequesta were not completely cut off from the wider Atlantic world. They were aware of foreign ships and occasionally interacted with them, whether through trade, salvage, or confrontation. Yet these encounters did not immediately transform the region into a colonial outpost. For most of the 17th century, Miami remained primarily indigenous in character. When I reflect on this period, I see a coastline where two worlds briefly touched but did not yet merge. The Spanish Empire passed along the horizon, powerful and expansive, while the Tequesta continued to live according to rhythms rooted in their own land and waters. Much of that intersection is still an open question, reminding us how incomplete the historical record can be. Imagine standing on the edge of Biscayne Bay in the year 1650. There is no skyline glowing in the distance, no bridges, no hotels, no towers of glass catching the sun. As night falls, darkness settles completely across the water. The only light comes from the moon and the stars reflected on the surface of the bay. The sounds are simple and steady. Wind moves through the mangroves. Water presses softly against the limestone shore. Somewhere in the distance, a canoe paddle enters the water and rises again in a slow and practiced rhythm. These are the sounds that would have defined Miami in the 17th century. At that time, this region was shaped by an independent indigenous culture that understood the demands of its environment. The Tequesta and neighboring communities lived within a challenging ecosystem of reefs, tidal flats, wetlands, and forests. Survival here required knowledge of seasonal change, marine life, and freshwater sources. It required cooperation and continuity across generations. There were no permanent European towns transforming this coastline in 1650. Spanish ships passed through the Florida Straits, but this specific landscape remained primarily indigenous in character. The social and spiritual life of the region was rooted in local tradition, not in imported institutions. When I reflect on this period, I do not see an empty wilderness waiting for development. I see a functioning world built on water and stone. The limestone bedrock beneath modern Miami already held meaning. The bay already served as a highway and a source of life. The wetlands already formed a protective boundary. Today, much of that world is hidden beneath roads, high-rises, and concrete foundations. Yet, the physical ground remains the same. Beneath the modern city lies the memory of a coastal society that once mastered its environment with quiet confidence. Miami in 1650 was not a city in its early stage. It was a complete and independent world, defined by water, land, and human knowledge deeply tied to both. Miami in the 1600s is not a story about a city. To me, it is the story of a raw wilderness, an independent indigenous culture, an ancient spiritual center, and a quiet intersection of worlds that few people talk about. It is also the story of a landscape that now lies beneath modern concrete and glass. The images in this video were created with artificial intelligence to help visualize this past more clearly. I would truly love to hear your thoughts, so please join the discussion and consider subscribing to Richard's History for more journeys into the past.